The stranger in my bed wasn't human. The first time I noticed something was wrong. It was subtle. Maybe too subtle for most people to notice. But I'm not most people. I've always had a finely tuned sense of awareness, the kind of skill that's kept me alive in situations where others might have faltered. That's why when I woke up to the faintest sound of breathing, too faint to be mine, I froze. My bedroom was dark, the heavy curtains keeping the streetlights outside from spilling in. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall, the distant bark of a dog on some neighbor's porch. But right beside me, closer than anything else, was the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. It wasn't my husband's. Mark had been gone for 2 weeks on a business trip to Germany. His side of the bed still held the faint scent of his cologne, but it had been empty every night since he left. Or at least I thought it had. I didn't move, barely daring to breathe as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The shape beside me was unmistakable. Someone was lying there. It wasn't Mark. The silhouette was wrong. The build all wrong. Too slender, too tall. My heart thundered in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to scream, to do something. But I stayed frozen, pinned by fear and the horrible uncertainty of what might happen if I made a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the figure stirred. I clenched my teeth to stop a gasp from escaping, watching as it rolled onto its side to face me. The movement wasn't natural. It was fluid, in a way that no human body should be. The bed creaked slightly under its weight, and a wave of icy cold air seemed to radiate from it, chilling my skin. "Claire," it whispered. My name. It knew my name. I bolted upright, scrambling away so quickly that I nearly fell off the bed. My hand fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table, and with a shaky flick of the switch, the room was flooded with light. The bed was empty. My chest heaved, eyes darting around the room for any sign of the intruder. The blankets were undisturbed, the pillow still neatly in place. There was no indentation where the figure had been, no sign that anyone else had been there at all. But I knew what I'd seen. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, the bright screen casting a pale glow in the otherwise normal room. I called Mark, even though I knew it was the middle of the night for him. He answered groggily after a few rings, his familiar voice grounding me slightly. "Claire? What's wrong?" There's someone in the house," I stammered. "Or there was. I don't know. It was lying next to me, Mark." "What? Claire, slow down. What do you mean someone was lying next to you?" I tried to explain, but even as the words spilled out, they sounded absurd. How could I convince him that I wasn't imagining things? That the figure I'd seen, the thing that had whispered my name, wasn't just a product of stress or an overactive imagination. "Lock the bedroom door," Mark said firmly. "I'll call the police." The thought of being alone while waiting for help sent a fresh wave of panic through me, but I did as he said, dragging a chair in front of the door for good measure. I sat there in the harsh light of the bedroom, clutching the phone like a lifeline as I listened to Mark try to calm me down. The police arrived half an hour later. They searched the house from top to bottom, finding no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the freshly fallen snow outside. "It's not uncommon for people to imagine things in the middle of the night," one of the officers said gently. "Stress, sleep deprivation, sometimes even a bad dream can feel real." But it wasn't a dream. As they left, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror above my dresser. A faint smudge on the glass, almost like the outline of a hand too long and thin to be human. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream. I told myself that the figure in my bed, the icy air, the whisper of my name, none of it was real. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that handprint in the mirror. Mark called again as the sun began to rise. I could hear the concern in his voice, but he didn't push me to explain. Instead, he reassured me he'd be home in 3 days, earlier than planned. "I'll book an earlier flight," he said. "Just hang tight, okay?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay." I spent the rest of the day avoiding the bedroom. I cleaned the kitchen, vacuumed the living room, even dusted the shelves in the office. Anything to keep busy and out of the place where it had happened. Still, the house felt wrong. The silence seemed heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on me. By afternoon, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was off. It started with small things. The picture frame on the mantel, the one from our wedding day, had shifted. I didn't remember touching it, but it was now tilted at an angle, as though someone had bumped into it. In the bathroom, the mirror over the sink had fogged up as if someone had taken a hot shower, even though I hadn't been in there all day. And then there were the noises. At first, I thought they were coming from outside. A faint creaking, like footsteps on old wood, and a soft tapping that reminded me of branches against a window. But when I checked, the yard was empty. No branches, no wind. The sounds were coming from inside. By the time evening rolled around, my nerves were frayed. I sat on the couch with the TV on, the volume turned up too loud, as if it could drown out the growing sense of unease. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Mark. "You okay?" "Thinking about you." I started typing a response, but froze when I noticed something. The faintest movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The hallway leading to the bedroom was empty, but I could have sworn I'd seen something. A shadow shifting, just out of sight. "Claire?" came a soft voice. It wasn't from the TV. I dropped my phone, backing away from the hallway. The voice had been low, almost melodic, but unmistakable. It was the same voice I'd heard the night before. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just silence. I didn't dare move closer to the hallway. Instead, I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy candlestick from the mantel, and stood my ground. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light from the TV made me flinch. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the bedroom. I gripped the candlestick tightly, stepping as quietly as I could. The door was still closed, the chair I'd shoved in front of it still in place. But when I reached for the doorknob, it turned on its own. I yelped, stumbling back as the door creaked open. The room was dark, just as I'd left it, but the faintest shadow moved across the far wall. "Claire," the voice whispered again, but this time it was right behind me. I spun around, swinging the candlestick wildly. It connected with nothing but air. The hallway was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed into the bedroom. My hand fumbled for the light switch, and when the room lit up, I felt a fleeting moment of relief. But then I saw it. The mirror above the dresser, the same one with the handprint from the night before, now bore a new mark. A single word scrawled in what looked like condensation. Soon. I didn't sleep that night either. The next day, I knew I couldn't stay in the house. My nerves were unraveling, and the idea of spending another night alone with whatever was haunting me was unbearable. I grabbed my keys and drove to a local diner, figuring I could pass the time with coffee and people around me. The place was nearly empty. A waitress with tired eyes brought me a mug of coffee and left me to my thoughts. I sat in the corner, close to the window, staring out at the gray sky. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Mark. "Hey, I got an earlier flight. I'll be home tomorrow night. Hang in there, Claire." I should have felt relief, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. Tomorrow night still felt so far away. "Rough day?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see an older man sitting in the booth across from mine. He wore a faded flannel shirt and had a face weathered by time and hard work. His eyes, though, were sharp and curious. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he added with a wry smile. I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't talk to strangers about my personal life, but something about him felt safe, comforting even. "It's been a weird couple of days," I admitted. He nodded knowingly, as if he understood more than I was letting on. "Weird how?" I laughed nervously, staring into my coffee. "I think there's something in my house. Something not human." When I glanced back up, his expression had changed. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a grim seriousness. "What's it doing?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, then told him everything. The figure in my bed, the voice that whispered my name, the handprint on the mirror, the word soon. I half expected him to laugh or tell me I was crazy, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You ever heard of a mimic?" he asked. I shook my head. "It's not a ghost," he said. "Not a demon either. It's something else. They're drawn to people who are vulnerable, people who are alone. They get inside your head, make you question what's real, and if you let them in too far, they'll take something from you." "Take what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Depends. Sometimes it's your sanity. Sometimes it's your life. But whatever it is, you don't get it back." A chill ran down my spine. "How do you stop it?" He gave me a long, measured look. "You can't fight it. Not directly, but you can make it leave. These things feed on fear, on doubt. You have to show it you're not afraid, make it think it can't touch you. Once it realizes it can't break you, it'll move on." It sounded impossible. How could I not be afraid of something so unnatural, so malevolent? But I nodded, thanking him for his advice. As I drove back home, the man's words echoed in my mind. "You have to show it you're not afraid." The house was quiet when I returned, but the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. I locked the front door behind me and walked straight to the bedroom. If I was going to face this thing, I wasn't going to cower in the corner. The mirror was still smeared with the word soon, but the room itself was empty. I stood in the center, clutching the candlestick I'd brought with me the night before. "I know you're here," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "You're not welcome in this house. Whatever you want from me, you're not going to get it." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. "Claire," the voice whispered again, but this time it came from the mirror. I turned to face it, my reflection staring back at me. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't moving with me, it was smiling. "You can't scare me," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "You don't belong here." The reflection's smile widened, stretching too far, too unnaturally. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in visible puffs, but I stood my ground. "You're wasting your time," I said firmly. The reflection stopped smiling. For a moment it simply stared at me, unblinking. Then the lights flickered again, and the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the mirror was empty. The house was silent again, but the silence no longer felt heavy. Instead, it was brittle, like the air was holding its breath, waiting for me to crack. My hands trembled as I set the candlestick down on the dresser. The reflection in the mirror was normal again, just me, pale-faced and wide-eyed, staring back. I didn't trust it. Every time I turned my back on it, I felt an overwhelming urge to look again, to make sure it wasn't doing something it shouldn't. But nothing happened. Not for hours. As the night stretched on, my exhaustion began to win out. I perched on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone like a talisman. Mark's text about coming home tomorrow night felt like a lifeline, but it was also a reminder that I was still alone. I don't know when I drifted off, but the dreams were worse than the waking nightmare. In the dream, I was back in bed, just as I had been the night before. The room was dark, and the air was freezing. A hand rested on my shoulder, long, thin fingers with skin like paper. It didn't grip me, just lingered there, impossibly cold. When I turned to look, the figure beside me wasn't human. Its face was featureless, just a pale, smooth surface that shifted like liquid. It leaned close, the void where its mouth should have been opening wide. "Give in," it whispered. "Let me in." I woke up gasping, clutching at my chest as though I could tear the fear out of me. My breath came in shallow pants, and it took me a few seconds to realize the room was dark again. The lamp I'd left on was off, and the chair I'd placed in front of the door had been moved. The panic hit me all at once, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I bolted for the bedroom door, yanking it open and charging into the hallway. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I swung the flashlight beam wildly, checking every corner, every shadow. The house was still, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the mirror hanging near the bathroom reflected something that wasn't there. The figure. It stood impossibly tall, its form too thin, too elongated. Its face was still blank, but the surface of its head rippled, as though it were trying to mimic a human expression. I turned the flashlight directly toward the spot, but the hallway was empty. The figure only existed in the mirror. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head as if considering my words. Then slowly, it raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass. Its fingers spread wide, and a faint crack spiderwebbed across the surface of the mirror. "Leave me alone," I shouted. The figure didn't move. Instead, it raised its other hand and began pressing harder against the glass. The crack spread further, a soft, splintering sound filling the air. I had to do something. Anything. I couldn't let it break through. My eyes darted around, landing on a vase sitting on the hallway table. I grabbed it, its weight solid and reassuring in my hands. Without hesitating, I hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, pieces flying in every direction. For a moment, the hallway was silent, the reflection gone. But then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard the whisper. Too late. The air turned icy again, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house, too loud to be just from the mirror I'd broken. It was everywhere, reverberating in every corner, every wall. And then the lights went out. The darkness was complete, pressing in on me from all sides like a suffocating blanket. My phone's flashlight flickered, and I clutched it tighter, praying the small beam of light wouldn't fail. The sound of breaking glass was everywhere, sharp and unrelenting. It wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It echoed from the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. I spun around, heart pounding, trying to pinpoint the source. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, devoid of even the faintest ambient sound. No hum of the fridge, no creak of the floorboards, no distant traffic from outside. I whispered into the void, "Who's there?" No answer. The floor beneath my feet felt different, slick and cold. as though the hardwood had been replaced by something alive. My phone's flashlight jittered again, casting weak, sporadic light into the hallway. I aimed it downward and recoiled. The floor was covered in glass shards. No, not glass, mirror fragments. Dozens of pieces, each one reflecting my panicked face back at me. But something was wrong. The reflections weren't moving in sync. In some of them I was smiling. I stepped back, careful not to cut myself, and aimed the light down the hallway. The mirrors lining the walls were shattered, their frames jagged and empty. Yet, in their surfaces, what remained of them, I could see the figure. It was everywhere, in every broken shard, every sliver of glass. Its blank face stared back at me from 100 angles, its body shifting and writhing as though trapped. "You don't belong here," I said, louder this time. My voice cracked, but I tried to summon the strength to sound confident. "Leave me alone!" The figure didn't respond. Instead, its reflections began to move, crawling across the shards toward me. The glass on the floor shifted, the fragments scraping together like nails on a chalkboard. I backed away, retreating toward the living room. But the glass followed. The pieces rearranged themselves, swirling together to form a trail that led directly to my feet. I tripped over the rug, landing hard on my back. My phone flew out of my hand, the flashlight blinking off as it hit the floor. I scrambled to grab it, but before I could, the shards began to rise. The fragments floated in the air, spinning and twisting, forming a shape. The figure was building itself again. Its limbs were jagged, made of splintered glass and sharp edges, but its movements were fluid, unnervingly smooth. It towered over me, its head tilting to one side, as if it were studying me. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice echoing in the suffocating silence. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised one of its elongated hands, the glass fingers catching the faint light from my phone. Slowly, deliberately, it reached for me. I scrambled backward, my hands finding the edge of the coffee table. My fingers closed around a heavy book, Mark's old hardcover atlas, and I swung it with all my strength. The book connected with the figure's arm, shattering it into a cascade of glass shards. The pieces rained down around me, but the figure didn't seem to notice. Its arm reassembled itself in seconds, the glass fragments pulling together like iron to a magnet. I was out of options. I bolted for the front door, ignoring the sting of glass underfoot. My bare feet slipped on the slick floor, but I managed to reach the door and yank it open. The outside air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp, but I didn't stop. I ran into the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the houses around me were dark, their windows empty. When I looked back at my house, the figure was standing in the doorway. It didn't follow me. It simply stood there, its blank face reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. And then, slowly, it raised a hand and waved. I didn't stop running until I reached the diner. When I burst into the diner, the bell above the door jingled sharply, but no one looked up. The place was eerily quiet, as if the world outside had fallen away, leaving only this one island of fluorescent light. The waitress with the tired eyes stood behind the counter, wiping it down with slow, mechanical motions. She glanced at me but said nothing. My breathing was ragged. My feet stung where glass had sliced through my skin, and my hands shook as I gripped the back of a chair for support. "Help!" I croaked, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Please, I need help." The waitress didn't respond. She just kept wiping the counter, her movements unnervingly repetitive. I stumbled further into the diner, toward the man I'd spoken to earlier. He was still sitting in the same booth, staring out the window as though nothing had happened. When I called out to him, his head turned slowly, almost too slowly, to face me. "Did you see it?" I asked, my voice trembling. It followed me. It's still there. He didn't answer. His eyes were different now, glassy and blank like a doll's. Something was wrong. The air in the diner felt heavy, pressing against my chest. The faint hum of the lights seemed louder, more oppressive, and the shadows in the corners of the room were darker than they should have been. And then I saw it. In the mirror behind the counter, where the waitress's reflection should have been, was the figure. It was watching me. "No," I whispered, backing away. The figure moved within the mirror, stepping closer as though it were walking through the glass. Its featureless face tilted slightly and its hand pressed against the surface, leaving no mark this time. "Claire," it whispered, its voice faint but clear, cutting through the oppressive silence. I turned and ran for the door, but when I pushed it open, the world outside was gone. There was no street, no cars, no sky. Just a swirling, infinite darkness that seemed to pull at me, tugging me closer with every second I stood there. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The man in the booth was gone. The waitress was gone. The diner was empty now except for me and the figure. I turned back to the counter, and the mirror behind it was cracking, spiderwebbing just like the one in my hallway had. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, louder now, closer. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its glass body shimmering under the fluorescent lights. Shards fell to the floor as it moved, but it never seemed to diminish. Desperation clawed at me. "What do you want?" I screamed. It stopped, tilting its head again. "Everything," it said simply. The lights in the diner flickered and the air grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I backed away until I hit the wall. "You're not real," I said, though the words felt hollow. The figure's form shifted, its edges blurring. When it spoke again, it wasn't in its voice, it was in mine. "Neither are you." The words hit me like a punch, and the world seemed to tilt. My vision blurred, and for a moment I saw myself in the figure's place, standing there, blank-faced and empty, staring back at me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not—" Before I could finish, the figure lunged. The world shattered like glass, splintering into a million pieces. For a moment, I was falling, tumbling through an endless void of reflections. My own face stared back at me from every angle, twisted into expressions I didn't recognize. And then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the diner anymore. I wasn't anywhere. The darkness around me was all-encompassing, so absolute it felt alive. My body was weightless, suspended in the void, yet I felt pressure everywhere, like 1,000 unseen hands pressing against my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice, my breath, even the pounding of my heart. Everything was muffled, as if the void itself was swallowing me whole. Then, out of the darkness, came the whisper. "Claire." It wasn't distant anymore. It was inside me, echoing in my mind, threading through my thoughts like an invasive vine. The sound of my name over and over, louder with each repetition, until it wasn't a whisper at all. It was a scream. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The noise was everywhere, deafening and overwhelming, drowning out every coherent thought until I was sure I would break. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse. I opened my eyes again, or at least I thought I did. The darkness had shifted, forming something, a shape. It was me. The figure stood in front of me, identical in every way, same hair, same eyes, same clothes. But its face was wrong. The mouth stretched too wide, the eyes were voids, and the smile it wore was something alien, something that didn't belong on a human face. "What are you?" I asked, though my voice felt distant, hollow. It tilted its head, mimicking the gesture I had seen so many times before. "You already know," it said in my voice. I shook my head, backing away. "Number, you're not me." Its smile widened. "Aren't I? I know your fears, your regrets, your failures. I am the pieces of you that you don't want to see, the parts you've hidden away." I stumbled, the weight of its words pressing down on me. The memories it spoke of surfaced unbidden, moments I'd buried deep, mistakes I'd tried to forget. The guilt, the shame, the fear. "You're lying," I whispered. "I don't need to lie," it said, stepping closer. "You brought me here, invited me in, and now I'll take what's mine." "What do you want?" I choked out, tears streaming down my face. It leaned closer, its void-like eyes boring into mine. "You." The darkness surged, wrapping around me like a living thing. I fought against it, thrashing and screaming, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the tighter it held me. The figure stepped closer, its form dissolving into shards of glass that circled around me. Each fragment reflected a part of me, my face, my memories, my fears, until I was surrounded by an infinite, fractured version of myself. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice echoing in the void. "No!" I screamed, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. "You don't own me!" The shards hesitated, their movement faltering. I closed my eyes, focusing on the warmth inside me, the small flicker of light I could feel buried beneath the fear. "I am not afraid of you," I said, my voice firm. The darkness recoiled slightly, and the shards began to crack. "You don't control me," I continued louder now. "You're just a shadow. You're nothing." The figure screamed, a sound so inhuman it sent shivers down my spine. The glass shards exploded, and the darkness shattered like brittle ice, crumbling away into nothingness. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on my bedroom floor. The house was quiet, the air still. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, and everything looked normal. For a long moment, I stayed there, staring at the ceiling. My body ached, and my mind felt raw, like I'd been torn apart and stitched back together. But I was alive. I got up slowly, glancing around the room. The mirror above the dresser was gone, nothing but an empty frame remaining. Mark came home that evening, his worried face lighting up when he saw me. I told him I was fine, that everything was fine, but I didn't tell him what had happened. Some things are too hard to explain. But deep down, I knew the truth. The figure wasn't gone. It was a part of me now, buried deep in the corners of my mind. And sometimes, when I look into a mirror, I see it staring back.